Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer, and this is Strange Mosaic. We have an awesome show today, but before we get started, just a quick message. If you are watching this show on the Off Planet Media YouTube channel, please also go over and subscribe to the Emily Moyer YouTube channel. Some of my work will continue to appear here, but all of my work will be on the Emily Moyer channel, and it'll always be there first. So make sure to hit the subscribe button over there. And now on with the show. My good friend Mark Devlin is back with me. It's been quite a while since he and I have spoken, and most of the content of what we've spoken about in the past has been about the misdeeds and corruption and crazy stuff going on in music in general, but specifically the underground dance music scene. And we will get back to that pursuit deeply in the second hour. But in the first hour, I just want a good chance to catch up with my friend here, see what's going on over in England and what his perspective is on all the things going on in the world, and then also dive into his new book, his novel, The Cause and the Cure, that unfortunately, due to social circumstances, hasn't gotten as much attention as it should, and that he would have liked, and hopefully maybe now will, as people are starting to bore of all the same old COVID and racism topics, that people can get back to researching and looking into things that actually interest them. So Mark Devlin, welcome to Strange Mosaic. Nice to see you, my friend.
Emily, good to be back. It's been a minute, as we just said. Good to connect with you. I always enjoy having conversations about electronic dance music with you because there aren't many hosts in the truth/alternative realm that have any kind of interest in that music and that culture. So it's always good to speak to a host that gets it. And we're on the same level with that. But yeah, 2020, what a year. I mean, none of us are having the kind of year that we expected to. We probably all had plans back in January as to what we wanted to achieve this year, and none of that has been achieved. If anyone has a 2020 calendar or diary, they might as well dash it in the bin now because it's useless. You can't make plans anymore. So yeah, it's an incredible year. As you say, I put out my first stab at allegorical fiction, The Cause and the Cure, towards the end of 2019. I just got that out before Christmas, and the intention was to spend 2020 marketing that, promoting it, doing some talks and presentations, touring the UK, maybe doing a few overseas gigs. I was due to be in the States in May of this year for an event called Seed for Growth. That didn't happen, along with everything else. So, yeah, my plans were kind of scuppered in terms of being able to promote this book. And I've been sidetracked and distracted by so many things over these past few months. That's a surprise, isn't it? That sometimes I even forget that I wrote it. And over these past few weeks and months that we've been in lockdown, I've had every good intention of actually starting work on the next book, which, would you believe, is going to be volume 3 of Musical Truth. And I am going to cap it at a trilogy because I've joked before that I could be writing new volumes of this book for the rest of my life, for however many years I've got left. But I don't really want to be getting up to Musical Truth volume 24, So I decided, like any good kind of movie franchise, cap it at a trilogy and tell the story in 3 parts. So I've got it all in my mind, what I want to put into this next book. It's all mapped out in there. And it's merely a case of just being able to focus and concentrate and finding the time to get all those words down on screen and then on the page. But I don't know about you, I've been finding it really difficult to focus and concentrate on anything these past few months. I've had a few things on my mind, and it's been the perfect opportunity for me to start work on this book because I've had the time. I lost my day job. As I said to you, I used to be a private hire driver, driving people to and from airports and such. Yeah. And that job went in February when people stopped traveling internationally, and it's not coming back. So I've had a lot of time where I could have been putting it to use in writing this book, but I've just not been able to get in the right headspace for it. So the intention is to achieve that next month in September when the kids finally go back to school, if that happens, and really knuckle down and get Musical Truth 3 written. But in the meantime, I'm still looking to market this novel as far as possible because this was a new departure for me. It's the first time I've tried my hand at this, and I took readers all the way back to 1990. So we're on the 30th anniversary of the events that happened in that book. You mentioned to me that you just finished reading it. So hopefully I took you back to a different time and space with that whole narrative. and hopefully it spoke to you in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you just said a lot of stuff there, a lot of interesting things. First of all, like there's a part of me that feels like there won't be a need for anything more than a Musical Truth 3 anyway, because it feels like the end of music is kind of here on a certain level, right?
I know what you mean, yeah.
There will always be music in terms of like how we enjoy it ourselves, but in terms of like there ever being anything not only of quality being put out on an external out there level anymore, but even anything worth talking about or people worth talking about it to try and help save from the dark undertakings of it, like that's all going away too. Like I feel like it's kind of, you know, when I look at my own musical community, right, like they want to be asleep, right? They want to be asleep. And so I think right now the last maybe group of people that we're going to be able to help with some of this stuff, right? Like there's a few stragglers coming in, and then going forward, I think our time is better spent on the pursuits that bring us spiritual growth and that bring us happiness. So I definitely look forward to seeing Musical Truth 3, because I think this last period of time that I'm imagining that you'll sort of encapsulate in it, and then also whatever like further research you've done into the past, I think will be fascinating. But I think, I don't think there's purpose to continue going on with all this stuff. Although you probably, I mean, you could literally go through almost every piece of popular music that was ever made and turn up a conspiracy underneath it. But yeah, this has been, and just by the way, for people who aren't familiar with Mark's work, because we have some, you know, new listeners and things like that. He's written Musical Truth 1 and 2, and we've done several shows together, and he's done shows with lots of other people, including just last week, you had a great interview with my good friend, Robert Phoenix. Robert's my co-host on one of my other programs, Matrix Mash, and I thought that interview was a really good sort of summary for people to understand your work and who you are and what's going on now, kind of all encapsulated into a nice, tidy hour and a half kind of thing. So people go check that out. But yeah, this year's been crazy. It has been, you know, this year had a lot of energy coming into it, right? Like you thought you were going to get out there with your book and maybe write another one. And I thought I was getting my business going, and I had stepped away from my outer job, the job I did just to make money, and decided I was going to spend this year just working on becoming able to work for myself, because I'm tired of taking orders and all of that kind of stuff. But it hasn't gone at all the way that we expected it to do. I think
what was that John Lennon lyric? He says, "Life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans."
Yeah, absolutely. So
isn't that the truth?
I think that but the thing that I'm recognizing, because it's been difficult sometimes to concentrate. I've actually been able to be highly productive during this period of time, and I think for me, part of it was just because since I had already stepped away from my job and planned on sort of working on things within my own kind of inner sphere, that I have been able to do it, even though obviously people's financial situations have changed, which affect the people who do the kind of work that we do, and lots of stuff has changed. But I think what's happening here is like the external is impossible to predict anymore. And so like, you know, any plans that we have with the external world, you can't really do that anymore. So the only place where that there is like a really great opportunity for a lot of progress or forward movement right now is in your own internal world, right? Like the work you do because you enjoy it and you think it's important, or your own spiritual growth, or your connections with the people who you've decided are your people. This period of time has been an excellent test of deciding who your people are and who they are not. Right? I mean, even just people who I thought were like one of my people at the beginning of this, and not that anything terrible or wrong happened or that there was a fight or a falling out, but just watching the way people have behaved and dealt with themselves and dealt with other people during this period of time has given me a lot of insight into who I want to be around or what really works for me and what doesn't. I'm assuming some of the same has happened for you as you've chosen to relocate to a different kind of environment. But what do you think about that? I mean, I do think that this planning thing, like what we're talking about, the way we've done things in the past, that's over. But there is this huge window now into like actually like really doing some of the things we want to do once we get past some of the like I feel like there's such a desperate attempt even towards those of us who are in the alternative media to keep us really focused on social justice issues and COVID-19 issues, right? And kind of if you just are able to push those aside a little bit, there's a great chance for lots of time to do other things.
Well, I'd always planned for 2020 to be a year of change for me personally. I had some plans on the cards, and the main one was moving house, moving the family, relocating from Oxfordshire, where I did live, to Northamptonshire, where I am now.
Yeah.
And we managed to achieve that. We moved in June. It was supposed to have happened a lot earlier because it's been on the cards for many, many months. So the COVID situation stalled that.
Yeah.
But pretty much the only good thing that's happened to me this year is being able to move. So we're now here in a great new home. We're just getting settled in it. Everyone really likes where we are now. We're in a very rural area, surrounded by nature, surrounded by fields. And we've had an incredible spring and summer. As I was saying to you, the weather in the UK since March has been incredible. Something poetic about it. We've all been under lockdown conditions, and yet it's been absolutely fantastic outside. Very little chemtrailing as well this year. A lot of people have commented.
Yeah.
And I've really been enjoying going out in the evenings for long walks in nature and contemplating and reflecting and kind of meditating and talking with God, talking with creation as I walk around. And that's been quite an incredible experience. So I always knew it was going to be a big year of transition, but I didn't quite expect what has been going on. I don't think anyone did. Although I'm currently putting together a presentation, which I'm going to be doing tomorrow evening in Birmingham, England, at a group called Truth Juice. It's one that I've presented at many times before, and they invited me to come back and do another talk there tomorrow about current events. So I've been putting together this presentation, examining all the evidence there is to show that the COVID-19 coronavirus situation was long planned for and was known to be coming on an elite level. As always, the general public were the last to know, aren't we always? But when you actually get down to all the evidence that was put out there, there has been no shortage of opportunities over the past several years for those able to interpret the symbology and work out the coded cryptic elements of it to be able to see that this was coming. It's the same with all things. With 9/11, for example, which is the greatest example we have of the phenomenon of predictive programming coming into play. So this is aspects of a real world event, which may or may not happen the way the mainstream media tell us it does. It may be a false flag. It may be some kind of scam or hoax. But the point is, the aspects of it that we're going to be asked to believe by the mainstream media are communicated to us in advance in movies, TV shows, music videos, and other popular culture vehicles. So 9/11, there's hundreds and hundreds of examples of that event showing that it was known to be coming. But it turns out when it comes to the coronavirus, it's only just slightly trailing behind 9/11, because I've uncovered scores of examples of aspects of this narrative that were encoded into movies and stuff. And I've put together a compilation of them, which I'll be presenting tomorrow. So we've got novels, books that seem to foreshadow it. We've got movies, we've got music videos, we've got Madonna's performance at the Eurovision Song Contest in 2019.
I was thinking of that, yeah.
Which directly played into aspects of this whole thing that we've been asked to believe. We've got, of course, The Simpsons, of course, South Park, because those two have got previous when it comes to predicting with uncanny accuracy things that are to come. And on top of all the popular culture examples, there's also a whole load of documentation that has come to light, which shows that this event was planned for years and years in advance. Specifically, there's this document people may have heard of coming out of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Lockstep document from 2010, where they're predicting exactly the kind of scenario that we've had unloaded on us this year, this deadly pandemic and preparedness for it and what steps would have to be taken in society to respond to it, such as isolation, quarantine, shutting down schools, shutting down businesses, social distancing, the wearing of masks. And then when it comes to masks themselves, there's loads and loads of symbolic references to that in recent times as well. There was an episode of Candid Camera that came out just a few months before this pandemic broke, where you've got these people sitting in a restaurant And supposedly they're being filmed, but they don't know that they are because it's candid camera. And the staff all come out of the kitchen and they serve them in masks. So the waitress is in masks. The chef comes out from the kitchen. He's in masks, in a mask. The manager comes out. He's in a mask. And these people who are supposedly, you know, real people are saying, oh, this makes me feel uneasy. I don't feel quite right about this. I don't like all these people in masks. This is creepy. And then a few of the people get up and walk out of the restaurant. And this was just a few months before every goddamn body on the surface of the earth is wearing masks in public places. So it seems as if we were being subliminally prepared for it.
Yeah.
We've also got, there's Disney movies where you got characters wearing masks on TikTok. And what's the other one? Snapchat. There's been this trend recently of people putting face coverings, you know, digital masks on themselves when they have a picture of themselves on the screen. That's getting kids used to the idea of everyone wearing masks. And there's bloody masks everywhere. So that aspect of it was known to be coming.
Well,
and we were being warned about it.
It's so interesting. You just said a bunch of interesting stuff, but I had an interesting phone call with my nephew about a month ago, right? My nephew is 6. And, you know, I was on FaceTime on the phone, on the iPhone with him and my sister. And he ran me through the whole exercise of showing me what he looks like with the cat, all the different, the cat face, the mouse face, you know, I mean, there was probably 40 or 50 of them. And to a kid, I see it's entertaining, but you're absolutely right. It's a form of masking. I hadn't really thought, and he discovered it during this period of time when we're all home with this kind of thing. And that's very interesting because you're right. That did just come about in the last few, you know, months and years, that there's all these ways of masking yourself on screen. The other thing and I noticed this, I didn't know what it meant, but as soon as the very first week we started hearing about the virus and seeing pictures of what it looked like and whatnot, about a year and a half ago, they had added emojis to the iPhone emojis that look exactly like the coronavirus. There's also a syringe and there's also a DNA helix, right? Those things were the last group of emojis added before all of this started.
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course, the celebrities have been playing their part in pushing forward the narrative. I mentioned Madonna. She's been tweeting about this whole thing. You've had all these pathetic, sickening, sycophantic celebrities just doing what they're told by their handlers. Lady Gaga, of course, curated this One World at Home concert back in April, where she supposedly brought together all these wrinkled old farts like Mick Jagger and you know, Paul McCartney, whoever it may be, Elton John, all these stars performing from their living room, you know, supposedly just them and their webcam, you know, and their guitar plugged into the amp and their piano. That's all it was. There wasn't really a team of engineers there. There weren't really people behind the scenes filming the whole thing, you know. So that was just to condition us round to the idea of, look, if Elton John and Paul McCartney can stay at home and self-isolate, then so can you. And Lady Gaga was the curator of that whole thing. And something I'll be mentioning in my presentation tomorrow is the irony of the fact that lockdown conditions have surely caused so many mental health issues among so many people that have just struggled to cope with the isolation, with being cut off from other people. Maybe they were getting some form of face-to-face counseling, and now they have to do it via a Zoom screen, which is just not the same as one-on-one social contact. How many suicides do we think have happened during this period that aren't being reported in the mainstream media because it's COVID? Yeah. But many people we know have committed suicide through the absolute distress of this whole situation. So the irony is that Lady Gaga's mother, a lady by the name of Cynthia Germanotta, turns out to be the mental health ambassador to the United Nations. You couldn't make it up, and you don't have to. So the daughter is there curating a concert where all these stars are saying, stay at home, folks, keep safe, observe distancing, don't go out, you know, keep the virus at bay. And then Lady Gaga's mother is an ambassador for mental health, supposedly helping people cope with mental health issues. Slight conflict of interest there in my book. But, you know, it's just one of so many absurd elements of this whole thing. If you're looking for common sense, if you're looking for logic in this whole thing, it's an exercise in futility. This whole thing is not supposed to be about making sense, as we well know.
But for some people, it's sure been about making dollars. They don't make sense anymore because apparently there's a coin shortage, but I don't think there's any shortage of dollars for Jeff Bezos and Costco and all of these companies that, have made tons of money during this period of time, right?
Yeah.
So it's about making dollars.
This is another good point. All these corporations have got TV commercials. It's certainly the case in the UK. It's probably the case in America and everywhere else. Ever since pretty much March, when we first went into lockdown, every company you've ever heard of, every household name corporation has a TV ad saying, we're doing all we can to help you through these difficult times. Our team are on hand to help you through. And then you get images of people on a Zoom call or a Skype call with this company, once again, reinforcing the idea that you don't need to have social contact with people when you can look at them through your smartphone screen, Yep. And all these companies are talking about how they're prepared to deal with this COVID situation. What strikes me as a little bit suspicious is how quickly these commercials were on screen after the initial announcements of lockdown. Within literally 2 weeks, you saw every company with a TV ad saying, we're doing all we can to help you through these times. Now, I've spoken to people in the business of commercial production and in the business of video editing and all this kind of stuff. And they've told me that to produce a TV commercial from scratch, from initial conception to getting it on the screen, takes several months.
Yep.
It's a matter of months. You can't turn one of these things around in 2 weeks. And yet we're being asked to believe that all these companies found out at the same time as us that this virus situation was getting out of hand. We're all going to have to isolate and go into house arrest and all this. And they turn these ads around in 2 weeks. Impossible. It's clear these companies had a heads up on what was coming. It's the same as all these stores and supermarkets that had their Perspex screens all ready to go. And they had all their signs saying, please keep 2 meters apart, and all their one-way systems and their little arrows and their little bits of tape on the floor. All of this would have been prepared months before it happened. So everyone knew it was coming except the general public once again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I spent time in Hollywood as a child myself, and I still, because I live here, know people who are in the business, obviously. And the very, very least that it ever is, from the time you shoot something till the time it gets aired, the very least would be 6 to 9 months. It's usually closer to a year. When I have friends who are thrilled because they finally, after 20 years of waiting tables, got a 2-second part in a commercial or whatever, right? Like they're waiting for it to come out. And it's like, by the time it comes out, I forgot that they even shot it, right? And I did stuff when I was a kid, and it would usually be about a year, 9 months to a year between when I actually filmed it to when it actually saw the light of day, kind of thing. Right. So, yeah, I mean, but people are very ready to believe all of this preposterous stuff. Like, people are so far removed from the reality of how things work. And that's actually, in my opinion, a function of this smartphone age. Like the way people think of things is you just touch a button on your phone and something happens. They think everything works like that, right? That you just push a button and something happens. And so for them at this point, like they have lost the ability to think through all of the other steps that might have to be involved in making something go from one state to another, right? So it's kind of interesting. I'm curious, and then we can kind of move after this and start to get into your book. But you just moved from a more urban place, Oxford, into the country. What is the difference in both the attitudes and the perceptions of the people where you're living in a more rural environment about what is going on socially? Like, are people more suspicious of the COVID and the masks? Do they believe it and they just don't feel like they have to play along as much because they're in a more rural setting? Or are they more questioning of reality than the people in the more urban environment? Because I'm here in Los Angeles, so I live in the most urbanized environment you can imagine. And, so there's not even it's very rare that unless you're in your own home, that you have space from other people to have your own thoughts, right? What about there?
Yeah, I have noticed some differences. I mean, first of all, the cost of living up here is cheaper, actually, than where I used to live. Food and drink and transport and stuff like that is quite a bit cheaper when you get out into the country. The town that I was in was starting to get really big. I lived there for 18 years, and it pretty much doubled in size during the time that I was there, and it was becoming a metropolis. It's probably going to be a blueprint for one of these smart cities, to be honest, the way it's going, because they're putting in all these new housing estates and all these new retail parks and all these new business parks. So I really felt it was time to get out of there, and I think I timed it right to come to this part of the world. In terms of people's attitudes to what's been going on in society, I think where I'm living now in this particular village, people seem to be quite relaxed about it, and people don't seem to be obsessed about the mask wearing. We've just had it made mandatory, supposedly, that you have to wear a mask when you go into a shop, even though when you get down to it, these are guidelines and recommendations coming from the government rather than legislation. So it can't actually be legally enforced. They threaten you with calling the police for people that go into a shop and don't wear a mask, but the reality of that actually being forced is very, very unlikely. So people are wearing masks in shops because they have to, but I get the impression that a lot of people are just not taking this whole thing seriously. They think it's been blown out of all proportion. What you don't get around here is people getting all paranoid when you walk towards them on the pavement and they're jumping into the road to get away from you. Whereas when I go into the larger towns to go and do my shopping, and I had to go into the town today, I notice a difference in attitudes. People are wearing masks even when they don't have to. So they're wearing masks in the street and in the park and as they walk around, and you even see some entertaining people wearing masks alone in the car.
Oh, those are my favorite.
they're protecting themselves from infecting themselves.
But that's actually the truth.
Very sensible.
That's actually the truth of this, though. My friend Jeff had a very astute observation about what was really going on a larger symbolic level when this mask obsession first began, right? And he basically said they cannot look at themselves in the mirror and face the lie they've been telling themselves, so they will gladly wear the mask, right?
Have you seen the video of I wear my face mask in my car?
I saw that like way back in April, and I love that. But what's hilarious is when I send it to people who like believe the line of reality, they're very offended by it, right? They think it's just so offensive. But no, it's hilarious. And whenever I see one, I start singing. I make up my own lyrics.
I do as well.
Yeah, I make up my own.
I wear my face mask in my car so I can virtue signal to the neighborhood. And then it says so I can placate all the Karens in the park.
Absolutely. I go on and on with my own. I always make up my own lyrics to songs and whatever. But I mean, I think there's a truth to that. What this is really about is how fearful people are of themselves. It isn't just fearful of other people, although they've encouraged that as well, right? But people have separated so far from their true nature that at this point they actually fear that. And the separation is so extreme that it lands people in this place that we've talked about in alternative circles for a long time, of they've basically outed themselves at this point as being NPC type people, right? Or clone type people, where there's actually no human sentience or innate thought or anything like that really going on.
It's like they're running a software program.
Yeah.
They've been programmed like a computer. And going back to what you were saying, I've noticed a real difference between urban areas and more rural areas. So people in smaller towns and villages seem to be much more relaxed about the whole thing. They're not losing their minds. They're not paranoid. But you go into a town and you see a difference. And then you go into a city, a large urban metropolitan population, and that's where you see it the most. That's where the social engineering gets done. In the big cities with the populations all crammed in together. You must see it in LA. It's going to be the same in cities like London, and any big city around the world. You're really going to notice a concentration of the social engineering and the mind control having taken people's minds.
Yeah, it's pretty, I'm very thankful and fortunate that I don't live in downtown Los Angeles where I used to live. As much as I enjoy urban activities, I live more it's still in a city, but it's a little bit more suburban. But I actually live in an area that is one of the oldest neighborhoods in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. So the pieces of land are much bigger, and the neighborhoods don't have like sidewalks or street lights or whatever. It's more, this is how the houses were when they first started building here, like in the late 40s and early 50s, right? So it happens to be that on our street, we don't it really, you'd think if you were in my neighborhood, you wouldn't think you were in the middle of the city where we are. So we have like a little place where there seems to be more sanity. Our neighbors seem relatively sane. I don't see mask wearing going on in the neighborhood, right? And it's kind of, I'm just really thankful. I used to live right in the belly of the beast in downtown Los Angeles, at the very center of where both the social justice and the, branch COVIDian movements, are kind of headquartered here in Los Angeles, right? So I'm thankful about that. We have a good sized yard and all of that kind of thing. And, fortunately, like you, because I've spent time cultivating friends in the alternative research community, both people who present and also just people who enjoy the material, I have and a lot of them happen to live here in Southern California. I have enough of a social group that, to the extent, unless I want to go out to eat or go to a shop or whatever, I can insulate myself to a certain degree from some of the nonsense, which a lot of other people in Los Angeles can't do. But no, I mean, I absolutely agree with you on the various levels of, I've traveled a little bit during this time, and when you're kind of out in the middle of nowhere, nobody gives a shit about the mask. And then as you start to approach civilization, you can feel the tension building and building and building. And when you're downtown, it's crazy.
There's more of a uniformity in cities, isn't there? A group think, a hive mentality. And the social engineers must love it when they draw up their plans and they predict how populations are going to react to certain situations, and they implement them. They sit back and observe, and people behave in exactly the way they knew they would. And we're seeing this everywhere. People in London are behaving the same as people in New York, are behaving the same as people in Sydney, Australia, are behaving the same as people in Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo. It's a human thing. It's the human psyche. It's the way human consciousness works. It's regardless of location. And the social scientists and the anthropologists and the psychologists who predict how people are going to react have a very good handle on the human condition and how it does respond to certain stimuli.
I have a question, because I'm just having a thought as we're having this conversation. I just kind of connected a dot I hadn't quite connected before. In the city that you just moved out of, are there starting to pop up a lot of these situations where there's like businesses on the bottom floor and lofts or apartments or things like that on the top?
Well, the town that I was in wasn't really big enough for that. That's certainly happening in some of the larger cities in the UK. Gentrification, New York style,
So what I'm like kind of just having the clarity of right now is that, obviously in very dense urban cities like New York and London and places like that, that has always existed, that there'd be some shops on the bottom and then apartments up top. But you're starting to see it now in more places like here, Los Angeles, there's a lot of space. So you don't really need there to be that kind of compaction. And same with other cities like Houston and Austin and just cities that are Phoenix and whatnot, right? But you're starting to see that in those places anyway, right? This sort of thing where it's like you have your Starbucks and, all your, sort of, most of them chain shops or whatever on the bottom floor, and then people living kind of up top. And it seems that's a phenomenon that really started here in the early 2000s and has now become very complete. And if you really think about it, this has been the most massive period of that kind of mind control from like, even though obviously the social engineering started in the 50s and 60s at maybe even earlier, right? Like there's really been a vast leap over the last 20 years that there hasn't been in the times before that. And that's one of the things, right? Like you have this people living on top of this corporate currency generating machine, right? That just sort of kind of binds all of that stuff together. And that is one of the unifying principles now between these massive metropolises we've always known and these smaller cities that are starting to become that, is that style of living. Whether it's necessary or not, people are doing it.
Yeah. It feels like they've been softening us up for some time for what's happening right now. There's been a long period of getting us ready for it. I mean, my mom often says to me, I don't recognize this world. I don't know this world. This wasn't the world I grew up in. And I say, Mum, I don't recognize this world. This world has changed since I was a teenager or a young man. Society has changed beyond all recognition over the course of the last 20 odd years. And that will all be by design. And a lot of social engineering has taken place. As I say, it's all been done subtly and covertly and subliminally. So nobody or very few people would be consciously aware that it's actually taken place. It wouldn't be a very successful program if people were aware of it. But people behave in certain ways and they accept certain norms and they just live their life in a certain way because they've been conditioned and entrained to just think of that as the way it's done. It's just how people live. But I think one thing that has certainly happened is males have been emasculated big time over the past generation or so. And I think that will have been, again, on purpose, ready for the kind of times that we're living in now. What would be the control system's worst nightmare in this COVID narrative where they're trying to lock everyone down, they're trying to take away our rights and freedoms, they're trying to impose ridiculous things like mask wearing on us against our will? Their worst nightmare would be an army of real men motivated by truth and freedom and a recognition of what rights are, standing up, unified in their mass numbers and saying, we're not having this. We're not complying with this tyranny. We're going to put this tyranny down because this is immoral and it's against natural law, it's against rights, it's against freedoms. But we're not getting that. And a comment that I've had so many times in correspondence that's been sent to me over the past few months is, where have all the real men gone? Where are they? There's no kind of uprising at all. I was out today and I saw big, strapping, physically fit men, tattoos, shaven heads, jewelry, all the rest of it, but they're wearing masks. Great big stocky tattooed guys that look like they're rugby players or something, and they're walking around in a mask because they've been told to. So they're either just meekly, obediently complying because they think when the government says jump, you ask how high, or they've bought the lie that there's this deadly contagion around and if they don't wear a mask, they could die. But these are exactly the kind of people who in previous generations would have risen up, would have taken on that responsibility, would have represented the rest of the community, would have come together in their mass numbers and would have resisted and pushed back against what's being done to us. But we don't have that. There are no real men, or very few real men, because of the way they're being conditioned generationally to think of themselves and their place in the world, and just to think of what life is and what government is.
You know what's crazy? Like, one of the things that has been really interesting, here for sure, but I'm sure there, is during this period, like, you're 100% right. And I'm now wondering if they did this intentionally just to test to see how well their emasculation program had worked. One would think that having taken away the ability to watch sports, play sports, go to games, which is where men have been mistakenly putting their tribalistic and their testosterone impulses for the past half a century, that with that being gone, some of this desire for like tribalism or defending their family or being, would come back to where it should be, but it hasn't. Right? They just accepted
alpha male tendencies.
Right. But they haven't.
Authentic masculine tendencies.
They haven't. And now a little bit of sports is starting to come back. But my thought at first was the elite really fucked up, because if they want people to be content staying in their homes, they should have left sports alone, because people will be happy to stay in their house and watch the football game and or whatever. But if they were truly trying to test to see if there were any males that had an ounce of testosterone left in their balls, or you know what I mean, or whatever it is, if they really needed to see how well their program had worked, you have to take everything, kind of pull it all back just to see what happens, what rises up, to see, can you proceed with the next level of your thing. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but none of that happened. I thought we would see, we hear reports that domestic abuse has increased and stuff like that, which would be, I guess, the only kind of display of masculinity that the system would be interested in,
That's a real man knocking his woman around in the home,
yeah,
but not going out and fighting for rights and freedom. Yeah.
Right. Or just not even, I mean, even like people have a variety of ways that they choose to deal with this, but like some people choose to fight or resist and others just choose to stand firm. I'm not moving. Like, this is the stance I'm taking and I'm not moving, right? You haven't even seen that. You've seen an ever leaning over, cowering, backing away from, shrinking into oneself kind of thing. And that's the thing with the sports, though. I think that's kind of interesting. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean,
well, it's incredible that they were able to cancel sports without any kind of an uprising, without any kind of resistance, really. And what was also incredible was that during St. Patrick's Day week in Ireland, they closed the pubs. The Irish government announced all pubs are going to close. I think it was on the eve of St. Patrick's Day. Now, if they tried that shit 30 years ago, there really would have been a revolution in the streets.
Yeah.
And Irish people, they like a drink. Come on, we all know this.
Yeah.
And if that right and that pleasure in their lives was taken away from them for no good reason a generation ago, they would have had something to say about it. But in 2020, not so much as a murmur. Everyone just put up with it. Same with the sports games being cancelled. So this has obviously been a long time in the planning. And a lot of people think that male hormones have been messed with, that there's traces of estrogen getting into the food chain, getting into the water, and it's been slowly feminizing men on a genetic level. It's been messing around with their hormones. And then the reverse has been happening. Females have been absorbing testosterone through different methods. And there's been a blurring of the genders and a dumbing down of those tendencies for each gender, and I'm sure that's a process that's been happening over many years. But the social engineers, the architects of this must have been very confident with where they've got everyone to pull stunts like this, to cancel football games. They must have known that there would be no kind of trouble, no kind of uprising. Same thing with closing the pubs. They knew they got everyone right where they wanted them. They knew that they'd prepared society for this on a gradual basis over many, many years. And they must be patting themselves on the back and congratulating each other on a job well done when they observe the results of their little social experiment.
Yeah, if it wasn't so gross, it would be humorous. But do you think that all of these, like, we've gone through, like, for many, many years now, these various levels, like we had serial killers and then we had school shooters and then we had terrorists and then we had whatever, right? Like, kind of thing. Do you think that, like, it was always designed to go to this place where it got to pandemics, or that those ones didn't quite work as well as they thought to scare people, so they kept having to try another one and another kind and a different kind, and finally when they tried the pandemic, all the pieces came together? Which do you think it is?
Well, they really have thrown everything they've got at us all at once, haven't they? It's like they've thrown the entire textbook at us. And this COVID narrative ticks so many boxes on the New World Order Agenda 2030 tick list, wish list. So many things they've wanted to achieve for so long. So I think it was always in the planning to drop this stunt on us. It was probably always in the planning to do it in 2020 as well, because there's lots of poetic little
hindsight is 2020, right?
Yeah. I mean, one is when you think back to the Georgia Guidestones and you think of that inscription where they're talking about maintaining humanity in perpetual balance with nature, and they talk about reducing the world's population to 500 million, which is a reduction of something like 6.5 billion from the people we currently have. Well, the Georgia Guidestones were unveiled on the 22nd of March, 1980. So that was 40 years ago. So you can fast forward 40 years from that event. 20 plus 20 is 40. So you've got the 2020 there. And many countries around the world, particularly the UK and parts of Europe, went into lockdown, and things started to get really serious round about the 22nd of March. And a lot of these events take place around about that time of year. It's in line with the spring equinox. It's the start of this 40-day period leading up to May Day, Beltane, Walpurgisnacht, the 1st of May.
Yeah.
And a lot of these events are done according to the occult calendar.
Yeah.
Many events of major world significance kick off around about March. So it's interesting that we've got the 40th anniversary of the Georgia Guidestones there, and clearly an aspect of this agenda involves reducing the world's population, not just through COVID, but through suicides and all these other fallout aspects of this thing. So yeah, it seems that they do go through phases. So we had the ISIS false flag terror phase. Right. So a few years ago, I remember there was one summer, what was it, 2015 or 2016, where every week there was one of these ridiculous, absurd events all over Europe. Yeah. Paris, then Berlin, then Munich, then Nice. And it was completely predictable and so transparent in terms of what they did with each one. And people were taking it apart within minutes in fine forensic detail because it was just so bloody obvious that these things were put up jobs and there were scams. And there was all this paranoia about ISIS, this dastardly jihadi terrorist group, and nobody's safe from them and they'll stop at nothing. Well, it seems they have stopped now because we haven't heard much from them over the past couple of years, have we? Wouldn't you think that COVID-19 will be the perfect smokescreen for them to carry out some of their dastardly terror attacks under, while everybody's at home and paranoid and quaking in fear behind their masks? They could be achieving all kinds of things all over the world. You know, all these government buildings, all these targets that they could be bombing and attacking, that they're not being watched properly and nobody's there. You know, perfect opportunity, but they don't do this. And of course it's obvious why, because ISIS was aspects of the intelligence services. It was aspects of the government of the various countries that were pulling off these stunts, and they've moved on now to something different. They're putting all their energy into the COVID coronavirus thing with a little bit of a diversion for the Antifa Black Lives Matter George Floyd event, you know, but that was just a little sideshow. And so that's where we're at now. We've moved through these different phases, and at this stage in the game, it's all about the pandemic. And also, it's interesting what you touched on earlier, because I spoke about this on the show with Robert Phoenix the other week, where we were talking about music genres and music styles and trends and movements and fads and scenes. And I made the point to Robert that I'm hard pressed to be able to think of any kind of discernible, easily identifiable fad, trend, movement, scene within music in the past 15 years. Certainly 10 years, probably 15, maybe even 20. You know, you go back to the 80s and the 90s. You had punk, you had new wave, you had heavy rock, you had the new romantics, you had acid house, you had hip hop, you had drum and bass, you had jungle, you had ragga dancehall, all these different genres. They all came with their own style, their own form of dress, their own lingo, their own cultural aspects. You could tell what scene somebody was into from the way they spoke and the way they looked. But since 2000, where has all that been? There have been no genres. There have been no scenes. I feel for young kids now growing up, and they're looking for some music to latch onto that's the soundtrack to their youth, because there's nothing discernible out there. It's all just completely bland. It's all just completely formulaic, and there's just nothing going on. And so I was speculating with Robert as to whether they're actually done with music now.
Yeah.
And that they're done with entertainment to a very large degree. They've been using music, the sound frequencies, the videos, the artwork, the live shows. They've been using symbolism in Hollywood movies. They've been using video games, all these different aspects of culture to program young people. Seems to me like they may have reached a point where they feel it's a good job done.
Yep.
They've got everyone where they want them. They've embedded all that symbolism and all those occult sigils and stuff in people's subconscious, and now they're moving on to other things. Yeah, it's like music is a done deal now.
I think you're right. The only discernible, and it was small because it was within the scene, music trend that I became aware of, and I became aware of it about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was terrible, and it was appropriately named. It was called trap music, right? Like it literally is the worst version of any kind of electronic music I'd ever heard. And these are like what the kids were listening to.
That's a good 10, 12 years old now, trap, right. 15 years maybe.
Right, but that's the last one that I'm sort of aware of, of a new kind that I heard of, and I was like, oh, this is terrible. But no, I think you're right. A lot of this entertainment, the purpose of it was to create entrainment, and the entrainment has been achieved, so it doesn't have to be entertaining anymore, right? Like the brain waves are all, with each group of people are all in alignment with whatever the intended frequency is, and it's not requiring. It's just maintenance now. It's not requiring any new methods to lure people by, for the most part, right? So what I want to do, I do want to, when we move to the second hour in a little bit, I do want to get into what I think is going on, because you and Robert actually started talking about like what is happening with these DJs. Like, do you think they were caught off guard by it? Like, what is the future of all this stuff that was built up so big? We're going to get into that in the second hour, but while we're still in the public hour, I do want to get into your book a bit, because I want people to be able to hear about it. I want them to be able to buy. I think it's available right now for people to purchase. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. This is The Cause and the Cure.
Cause and the Cure. So I just read it. I started reading it back in November. You gave me an early manuscript, and I started reading it on a trip back at Thanksgiving time. And then I got very ill. Whatever, to the extent there is any kind of virus, I think I had it back in November. I was down with something for almost a month, and that is very unusual for me. But I started reading then, and then I got distracted with all the crazy, with the illness, and then all the crazy things that started happening after that. So when I knew you were coming on, I got back and I read the book, and I finished this morning. And it's a novel. It's fiction, but for those of us who are astute and aware, we can recognize characters and places and things like that. So
I refer to it as truth fiction. I think there should be a new genre, truth fiction.
Yeah. Is it based on the city is where you just moved from, basically, correct? The city where you've spent most of the last portion of your life. Why don't you tell people a little bit about why you decided to do it this way, to write a book like this in novel form, and just tell people a little bit about this story you've written?
Yeah, it was a story that was just waiting to get out of me. It was an itch I needed to scratch. I first of all wanted to try my hand at fiction, because I was a great admirer of certain writers, and I just wanted to set myself the challenge of writing a fictional story. I knew I could write non-fiction, so I wanted to move on to that level as well. And they say you should write about what you know. And I know a lot about the city of Oxford. I was born there, spent most of my life living around there. And I set the story in 1990 because I know a lot about those times. I've got lots of fond memories of what the world was like in 1990. So I wanted to bring the book out on the 30th anniversary of those times. And part of the job was to show just how much society and culture has changed in 30 years, which is not that long of a time in the overall scheme of things. And yet, when you look at the way people were living their lives in 1990, and you juxtapose that with life in 2020, it's almost unrecognizable. So I've made a lot of the very primitive technology that was around in 1990 and drawn attention to that during the story. So you've got things like characters out in the street needing to make an urgent phone call. Well, in 1990, nobody had cell phones. So you had to fish around in your pocket for a coin, hope that you had a 50-pence piece, and go to a public phone box and put that coin in and dial the number on a rotary dial to get through to somebody. It was the very early days of mobile phones, but they were the size of a house brick.
Yeah.
They had a great big antenna at the top. They were really heavy and bulky, and the battery lasted about 20 minutes before you had to put it back in the charging dock. So I've made reference to that. The story is set to a very large extent in a radio station, and that's based on personal experience because I worked at a radio station called Fox FM in Oxford from 1990. It was like my first induction into the music industry as an intern. And I stayed there till 1996. And the way things were done on the radio station at the time was making use of the technology that was there then. So everything was done in analog. This was a pre-digital era. It was the last days of analog, actually, before digital came in the mid-90s. So back in 1990, you had reels of tape. Nothing was done on computer. Everything was recorded onto tape. When on a radio station, you would hear the jingles, the ads, the weather, the news intro. They were all on loops of tape inside plastic cartridges, which you would load into machines like tape machines and press a button. and this loop of tape would just go round and round playing the jingle. DJs still played music off of vinyl on daytime radio. Imagine that. You would have the drive time presenter queuing up a piece of 7-inch vinyl and spinning it back and then pressing the start button to play the song. So it was partly a nostalgic journey back to these lost times, which I have very fond memories of. But then when you get beyond those elements of the story, I've loaded it with symbolism, I've loaded it with allegory, and I've loaded it with kind of spiritual teachings and truths. And that's a great thing about fiction, because when you're writing non-fiction, you have to provide citations and references for everything, because you make any kind of statement that somebody takes issue with, and they'll want to pull you up on it and say, that's incorrect. Where did you get that from? It's not that, it's this. Show me where the source was for that claim. With fiction, you can get away with saying all kinds of outrageous stuff. And if people try and pull you up on it and say, that's nonsense, you can say, relax, man, it's fiction. Come on, everyone knows this. But in reality, you are communicating great truths. You can get stuff across under the guise of fiction that's really going to hopefully resonate with the reader and teach them something and inspire them and really get them thinking about things. But because you've dressed it up as fiction, you can say whatever you want. And that hopefully led to an entertaining story. I've weaved aspects of spirituality, natural law, consequentialism, karma into what happens to the characters in the story. And many of the characters are based on people that I used to know back in the day in Oxford. They are all original creations, but they've got some of the mannerisms and some of the idiosyncrasies of people that I knew. And I've even got a little cameo in the story for myself, or a couple of cameos actually, Alfred Hitchcock style. So I've kind of put myself into the story. And I think it can be read on many different levels. So I've often said this about the book. If you want to enjoy it as a murder mystery, as a thriller, then you can. It's there on that level for you to read and absorb it. But if you want to go a few levels below that, it's like peeling away the layers on an onion. Yeah. You get another layer underneath, and then you peel that layer away and you realize there's something lying underneath that still. So truth seekers and students of the occult and people that like esoteric subject matter are going to find stuff below the surface narrative. So forgetting that it's a murder mystery thriller, you can find all kinds of stuff being communicated on different levels in coded cryptic form, I feel. And I was inspired in that process by the likes of Stanley Kubrick and many of these great film directors that encoded great truths into their films. And I've given the example many times of The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's treatment of the Stephen King story. I've watched so many analysis documentaries of The Shining, and I've seen at least 5 or 6 different interpretations of what that movie is really all about. Yeah. Forget that it's this guy that goes a bit crazy in the Overlook Hotel from the isolation, and he gets murderous and chases his family with an axe and tries to kill them. That's the surface narrative. There's 5 or 6 different coded symbolic interpretations of that movie that I've heard from different commentators. And it's a work of genius on the part of Kubrick that he was able to put so much into that movie, hidden below the surface, where you have to really go digging to find it. And I thought, if I can achieve only a fraction of that process with this book, I'll be very happy with the results. So that's what I attempted with it. I am pretty happy with how it turned out. Yeah. But ultimately, it's down to readers as to what they take away from it.
Yeah. So first of all, I think you did do a good job. There was obviously a lot of the kind of ideas and material and storylines are things that I'm very familiar with, but there was a few little unexpected twists in there that I didn't even see coming that were what you're talking about here. And I guess right now, as I'm listening to you describe it, what I'm kind of thinking of, do you know who Robert Anton Wilson is?
Yeah, sure.
Right. So one of the things he talks about is this idea, and I think others have too, but I think his description of it is best, what he calls chapel perilous. When you get to this space where you discover that the world isn't what you think it is, right? Like you're on this precipice, and how each person handles it sort of determines what level of, because he has this idea about, a lot of his work was based around trying to figure out what the Illuminati was and if it existed or not. And he kind of came to this place that it's sort of this nebulous thing that is an idea for some people, but a reality for others, sort of based on the decisions you make when you find yourself at Chapel Perilous, right? And so when in hindsight now, looking at the book, like each character sort of walked up to the window, right, of Chapel Perilous, or each of the main characters, and each had a different sort of response as to how they were going to deal with it, and ultimately each sort of, you know, in their own way, had to deal with the karma that the decision that they had made generated. So good job on that. It's an entertaining read. Things have been crazy for me, so I found myself like needing to read it fairly quickly, and I was able to. It was not challenging to just sit there and read 50 pages, 60 pages at a time, where some books, it's like, even if they're good, you can only read 20 or 30 at a time. So guys, if you know, it's an entertaining read. I think it's also like, if you have one of those friends who, like, you know, they're like not asleep, they're like asleep, but like they've been around you long enough to recognize that there's some level of cohesiveness to the stuff you're telling them or the narrative you're telling them, but they haven't been able to sort of, you know, arrange it all in a way that makes sense for themselves. A story like this sort of weaves together, you know, some of how this stuff happens. I'm assuming that you're the kid that used to go buy tapes that had been recorded from the satellite of right, of the BBC or whatever, the recordings of the music you couldn't get when you were living. That was your first cameo appearance, I'm guessing.
No, actually, that character, that's Drew, who is the cousin of Verity Hunter. This is another thing about the characters. They all have coded names, with very few exceptions.
Wasn't there a kid who came in just to buy? Drew was the guy who was doing it, right?
Yep. There was a kid that came in to buy cassettes from him.
Yeah.
That he taped off the radio because he had an antenna that could pick up all the London radio stations. And this was a very real thing in Oxford.
Yeah.
There was, you know, cassettes of radio shows were like currency. Yeah. Because back in those days, if you lived in Oxford, you couldn't pick up all the London radio stations, all the pirates. And so people would tape them and sell the tapes. No, that wasn't me. I appear elsewhere in the story. But yeah, all the characters have coded names. Yeah. So some are very obvious. Yeah. The lead female character, and this is a thing, I wanted to set myself the challenge of having two principal female characters, because I thought it'd be the easiest thing in the world for me to have male characters, for them all to be male. I wanted to give myself the challenge of trying to get into a female mindset and just trying to think from the point of view of a woman, you know, the best I could. And so the central character is Verity Hunter. Yeah. And of course, Verity is derived from verite, veritas, the Latin truth. Yeah. And then Hunter means seeker, so she's a truth seeker. And then you've got a police constable, a woman police constable by the name of May Pierce. Yeah. And the reasoning behind her name is May means possibility, something may happen. Yeah. And Pierce is as in piercing the veil of illusion and seeing what lies beneath. So she's someone that may pierce that veil. She has the potential to become a truth seeker and to embrace that process. The question is, will she? Yeah. So I've kind of juxtaposed those two female characters' situations. So Verity is a radio news reporter, and during the course of the story, she comes to realize that the world is nothing like she thought it was. And meanwhile, you've got May Pierce, and through her experiences in the police, she's coming to these same difficult realizations, and they're both going through this truth-seeking process. And towards the end of the story, they kind of come together and, you know, start an alliance. So I've used the city of Oxford as a microcosm for the world in general. So everything that happens in the city of Oxford is representative of what happens in the world. And so you've got this secret society organization, which I've simply called the Order. And Verity and May and the other characters, Keith, come to realize that anyone of any kind of standing or significance in Oxford, it can be the head of news or the managing director at the radio station, it can be the head of police, the chief superintendent, it can be judges, it can be university lecturers, dons, professors. They all have affiliations to this order, this mystery school secret society. And of course, that's the way it is in the world. That's the way the world operates. And all of this happens within the confines of Oxford. And so I used the city scape and all the locations to tell the story. And that drew on my knowledge of the city. And it's a fascinating city to get into because Oxford is basically Illuminati Central in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
You've got Oxford and Cambridge University for the benefit of listeners outside of England. And they're kind of like Harvard and Yale in England. They're the two elite principal universities, and they're the breeding ground for all these elite types. That's where all the politicians and all the business leaders and all the aristocrats go to get their training, to get their indoctrination. So Oxford churns all of these people out. I mean, Bill Clinton studied at Oxford, Osama bin Laden studied at Oxford, countless politicians. I mean, David Cameron, Boris Johnson studied there. So many famous authors have come out of there, famous actors. So Oxford is a great place to base a story like this, where you've got aspects of the occult, you've got aspects of esoteric teachings. And so I had a field day making use of the locations in the city. And all the locations that I mentioned are very real places. And I've suggested in the book that there could be the Cause and the Cure tour, where if somebody wanted a fascinating weekend in Oxford, they could actually go around all the places that I mentioned in the story and see them for themselves and absorb the atmosphere of these places. So I hope that brought an element of realism to it. And the other aspect of the story, which I hope you would have found of interest, is that there's a subplot running beneath the narrative, which when you take away the murder mystery element of it and even the occult and esoteric aspects of it, you have a subplot involved with the very early days of the acid house rave scene in the UK. So summer 1990 was a big time for all these open air raves that took place pretty much around the M25, the London Orbital motorway, in fields and various remote locations around the M25. That's where the group Orbital got their name from, that came through with time in 1990, the London Orbital motorway. So you've got a couple of these characters who are very much entrenched in the acid house rave scene in its very early days. And with that, you have, of course, ecstasy culture, MDMA, as I documented in Musical Truth Volume 2, from a studious kind of perspective, just researching the whole thing. This is a fictional representation of that, but where you found electronic dance music and these kids getting together under strobe lights to dance until the sun came up, you found ecstasy pills in unending supply. And in the book, I've suggested that this supply of pills was coming through the government intelligence services, which it actually was, by the by. And of course, it was the same thing in the United States back in the 60s with all the LSD. And I suspect in more recent times with the MDMA that's been around there, all coming through the intelligence security services. That's the way it works, folks, it turns out. So that's another aspect to the story. And I also had great fun drawing on my memories of those days, of the raves, of the music that was around. I've mentioned some of the tracks. I've mentioned the lifestyle that these kids were into, where they just literally live for the next weekend. By the time Tuesday comes around, they're on a massive downer. They've crashed and burnt from the weekend. And the only thing they can think of is doing it all again when Friday night comes around.
I think you did, I think you did a good job at capturing that. I mean, my coming into the dance music scene was a few years later than that, but it was still very much of that, still very much in that way. It was a lot different then than it is now. There are some similarities that have carried through. But what I think was, for me, actually the most interesting part of that was what possibly the backgrounds of are of the people who make up the dance music community, right? And whether, and how there are these people that show up that, like, it is odd that, their parents are in the police or in intelligence or whatever, right? And you also have these characters that are very much in the scene that are, I'm not going to give away the plot of the story, but do come from this place of having their relationship with truth tested. And even though they started down a good path, right, they got in a little over their heads and they sort of embed themselves later into a certain kind of scene. I mean, I know for myself that some of my awarenesses of what's going on in the world and led me to the interest that I have were seated in a very weird way in the dance music culture. Both the biggest loads of bullshit, I believe, and the biggest pieces of truth, I came to believe, kind of were all seated in the same place, right? And that's very much, in my opinion, the obvious signs of a telltale intelligence operation, right? And it's just the different ways that the people who are exposed to that deal with it. And also the way that, like, whether it's done, because in some cases it's done very methodically and intentionally, and other ways you don't have to, other times you don't have to. You can just seed certain thoughts and ideas, or even seed a few certain people in one place, and then by just the nature of the way things develop, it'll transport itself to another place and start another version of that same scene that then you can observe and learn from and decide what you're going to create next, and on and on and on. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of, and you know, that sort of is alluded to towards the end of the book with who shows up where at the very last scene, right? And so I think that we've been experiencing this kind of thing, that like some of these things are intentionally created and others just sort of seem to spring up magically on their own, but then are harvested into another creation and another kind of thing. And it's very true. Like, what we take as our enjoyment and our entertainment is very much a collaboration between Intel and Vice, as I have said recently in another show, that you know, where you have people who are into illicit things and you have intelligence, very interesting things will come out of it. You know what I mean? But there will always be, if you're willing to look, the fingerprints left behind of what went on there. It's not hard to track.
That's right. We've kind of come full circle in the conversation, because we're talking about social experiments. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about how interested parties will be observing how people are reacting to the COVID scam. Right. Who's getting paranoid, who's getting afraid, who's not buying the hype, who's wearing a mask, who's cooperating, who's pushing back. You can bet that all these things are being observed and noted. And so it was with the early dance music scene, the acid house scene, the germination of the whole electronic dance music scene in the UK, which then got exported to many other places, took place around about these times, late 80s, very early 90s. And that would have been a big social experiment. And it's very much the elephant in the room. We've spoken about this in previous conversations where, you know, I'm still dumbfounded that I seem to be one of a small handful of researchers at most that have ever identified any kind of social engineering aspect to the dance music scene. It seems absolutely everyone else, including DJs, producers, promoters, people that were a part of the scene, unless they're in denial or unless they've got an ulterior motive for not letting on, everyone seems to think that this was some organic grassroots thing that just evolved. It's just this wonderful thing. It just happened that way. And that's just the mythos of the whole thing. You know, nobody seems to acknowledge that there were controlled aspects to it. I seem to be such a lone voice in putting out that point of view. And yet, in Musical Truth Volume 2, I think I laid out a fair amount of pretty compelling evidence for anyone that is prepared to go there, to go to where the truth takes them. And yet, you don't hear other people talking about this. And it's still the elephant in the room. And I wonder if the story will ever be adequately told in this generation.
It's very interesting. I mean, you know, so I have this unusual scenario of like two of the scenes that I spent much of my life in have, you know, been sort of being looked at and examined on some level in the last few years, and that's gymnastics. I'm sure you're very familiar with the doctor Larry Nassar, who sexually abused hundreds of girls, right? You've heard the story?
Actually, I haven't, no.
Yeah, so, you know, I grew up in gymnastics here, and everyone who's involved in gymnastics, it was very, like, well-known but unspoken thing that there's a lot of, you know, pedophiles that are involved in the gymnastics world, whether they be coaches or photographers or other parents or whatever. And it was one of those things that you always knew something was weird, but you didn't really talk about it, mostly because you didn't necessarily have a language to. And then, you know, in the early 2000s, little bits and pieces started to seep out, but it was kept a lid on. And then just around the time of the 2016 Olympics, finally, like a story broke about this doctor named Larry Nassar, who's the national team physiotherapist, that he had been, accused of molesting girls. And once one person came forward, it's to the point where there's hundreds, maybe thousands, who've come forward of having been by this same person abused, right? And he's in jail, but right up into including the huge stars of gymnastics like Simone Biles and Allie Raceman and whatever. But what the gymnastics community is missing, and nobody wants to hear me say, is that he's just the Jeffrey Epstein, right? They've made a scapegoat of him so that they can point and say, oh, we've gotten the big monster, when the problem is embedded in every layer of the culture.
Every industry has one. It's the same with Jimmy Savile. It's the same in any walk of life. There's always that scapegoat.
The one. And when truthfully this is happening in every gym practically, I mean, there's a few that have done a really good job at keeping things clean, but it's happening in every gym. So you have predators, and then you have people who cover up for them because they're also doing corrupt things when it comes to maybe something financial or something political in terms of the higher up stuff of gymnastics. And so this has been going on, and I've spoken out a lot about it. Now, because the media has paid a lot of attention to this, I do get a lot of people kind of interested in asking me about this, because I was speaking about it before the case ever broke. I had started speaking about the pedophilia that went on in gymnastics, and there's been a lot of movement in that, but because the people in the gymnastics community refuse to look at the overall problem in society and see the way that this case is actually connected to, the pedophilia that goes on in government and Hollywood and stuff. It's not a different thing. It's not like a one little exception. It's the way that the Larry Nassar case went down is a perfect blueprint for what's going with Jeffrey Epstein. Almost like they had a little miniature run first, you know what I mean, kind of thing. So there's that. And then I've been speaking out now since before I met you about the stuff in the underground dance music scene. And while I get a lot of what you said, it was interesting how many hosts are not interested in this topic, right? Certainly there are listeners. That's probably the thing I get the most amount of contact from people on, that they will tell me that there's a lot of listeners in the alternative media who like the electronic music. So if there's not a lot of hosts, there are a lot of listeners. And I get stories that when they heard me tell the story, like they were relieved to hear somebody else say it because they always felt like something weird was going on or whatever. They all have stories about it. But, like in terms of, you're correct, like the other hosts, and certainly my hope had been more people in the dance music community would recognize it. I almost hear nothing. We have the occasional little coming over from someone over there, which we'll get into in the second hour, and trying to shout us down. But to be quite honest, like I don't even think Facebook shares the videos I make about it with the people who I'm connected to in the dance music scene. I think it's all walled off in there. There's no questions. People just buy bullshit, hook, line, and sinker. And I think part of it is that they don't want to hear it. Is that they don't want to hear it. But I also just think that, like, I think it's denial. Yeah, I think it's mostly denial, but it's also just like, I actually think some people don't care. It isn't just that they're in denial of the fact that it could happen, but they're just like, oh, well, it's fun and it's good, or whatever. And I'm just like, it's hard because, you enjoy a music, as I certainly do. I don't like that this is the truth about the scene. It doesn't change that I like the music, right? But I don't understand this, like, insistence on believing things that aren't true,
Well, people may not have cared, but we may have reached a point where they're going to have to start caring because there's not going to be a scene anymore.
No more.
This might segue us into part 2 here.
Yeah.
But look at what's happened this year.
Yeah.
First of all, what are people going to be watching in the cinema next year if we're even able to go to cinemas? There have been no frigging films made.
Yeah.
There's been no Hollywood productions this year. What are we going to be watching on TV next year? No TV shows have been getting made.
Yeah.
And although that doesn't necessarily apply to electronic dance music, because people can make tracks at home in their home studios. They've been doing that for many years already and exchanging files back and forth with vocalists and such. In terms of the scene as it relates to clubs and festivals and raves, maybe that's all over now. Maybe it's not going to go back to how it was. So maybe people whose lives were in this scene and who had a lot invested in it are going to have to start paying attention pretty seriously, because I don't think these festivals are coming back on the scale that they were anytime soon.
Yeah.
As just one of so many consequences of this COVID era.
Absolutely.
We'll probably
All
want
right.
to talk some more about that in part 2, right?
Yeah, I think we'll dig deep into that in part 2. So we're going to take a little bit of break. Before we go, let people know where they can find you, all your work, your podcasts, your music shows, everything like that. Let people know.
Sure. Well, my YouTube channel is youtube.com/MarkDevlinTV. And since March, since lockdown began, I've been putting out a weekly video giving my thoughts and my reflections on what's going on in the world, and particularly what's going on in the UK. And a lot of people have told me that they found value in that. A lot of people tell me that they look forward to my next installment. They want to know what I'm going to have to say about things. I'm very flattered that people would say that. And to be honest, the reason I keep putting these videos out is because people tell me that they found great value in it. And they've told me that they find some solace in hearing me articulate things. And I think what people like about these videos is the fact that I display pretty much every human emotion going. You know, sometimes I'm pissed off, sometimes I'm depressed, and I'm right down there down in the dumps and in absolute desolation. Other times I'm full of hope and optimism. Other times I'm fired up and I'm ready for a fight. Other times I'm angry. I go through every conceivable human emotion, and most of these occur during the course of the average day. So yeah. I can go from deeply depressed to high on hope in the course of the average day. And so I channel all that into my videos, and people tell me that they enjoy those. So you can find all those on my channel. All my interviews are up on there as well, all my podcast appearances and all my Good Vibrations shows. That's at Mark Devlin TV on YouTube. In terms of my books, they're all available on Amazon. That's Musical Truth Volumes 1 and 2, which are the non-fiction books, and The Cause and the Cure, which is the novel that we've spoken about. But if people want to bypass Amazon and get those from me direct, I can send out signed copies anywhere in the world. You just got to drop me an email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com, and I can get those books sent out. And everything else.
You're also doing t-shirts and informational pamphlets and stuff now too, aren't you?
Well, I have been, yeah. I've put together some resource leaflets, which I've offered to mail out to people that want to distribute them. And it's full of alternative information about coronavirus to counter the official narrative that we get from the mainstream media and the government. It's resources that regular, normal members of the public would never think to look at if they didn't have it put in front of them. So people have been helping me in distributing these leaflets and getting this alternative, empowering information out there. I'm out of leaflets now, but I may get another batch printed up. And I've got t-shirts with the slogan, "I do not consent and I was never asked," which are t-shirts for all occasions. They're really good conversation starters, and a lot of people have been getting those t-shirts from me. They're available in 4 sizes, and I can send those out anywhere in the world as well. So again, if you're interested in an "I do not consent" t-shirt, please drop me an email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com, and then everything else that I do is on markdevlin.co.uk.
All right, guys. Thank you, Mark. And join us at patreon.com/offplanetmedia. In hour 2, we are going to delve deep into the dirty deeds of the underground dance music scene. And we're going to talk about one of our favorite lifetime actors in that scene. All right, guys. We'll see you on the other side. Be right back.